Hey, it's Dr. K. I'm a California licensed naturopathic doctor and certified sacred medicine woman. Welcome to the Divine Woman Wellness Podcast. This is a show about whole body wellness that is going to support you in finding alignment with your body, mind, and spirit. I believe every woman should have a deeper understanding of her body and soul, and my mission on this show is to guide you through learning about your body, how you can shift your day-to-day life to support health and wellness, while connecting to yourself on a deeper level. These episodes are rooted in naturopathic medicine, vitalism, biohacking, and mysticism, and will guide you towards well-being in body, mind, and soul. Thank you for being here. Let's dive in. Welcome, my loves, to another episode of the Divine Woman Wellness Podcast. This is actually episode 13, and I'm so excited because I just realized it's been about 3 months now since I've started this podcast, and I'm just so excited for all the listeners and all the wonderful feedback that I'm getting. So I guess we're going to keep going and explore some more topics. And again, if you have any topics that you would like for me to cover in a little bit more detail, or if you have just specific questions, something you've always wanted to hear a podcast on, feel free to reach out to me at divine_woman_wellness on Instagram and just shoot me a DM. I would love to start the conversation on, bringing you topics that really matter to you. And of course, I always bring you current topics, things that come up in my patient care or even in my peer groups. And today, that's actually one of those conversations that I wanted to bring to your attention and dive a little deeper on, because obviously with every patient, we discuss dietary intake, and I oftentimes get asked, hey, Dr. K, what's the right diet for me, or what food protocol should I follow? Don't mind my doggie in the background there. She wants to also be heard on this topic. Actually, really fun fact, my poor little puppy has very severe food intolerances, so I'm really glad she found us as a family, because she actually has not irritable bowel. She actually has inflammatory bowel disease. She actually has chronic colitis, and so we were able to successfully treat that with food intolerances. So kind of funny that she's making her mark known during this podcast. But what I was saying is I have that conversation with my patients. What is the right diet for me? And we, obviously I get a lot of comments with, I've tried this diet, I've tried that diet, I've tried them all. And yes, I hear you, bear with me. And then diving a little deeper, even with my colleagues, we have these conversations like, well, what is the right dietary approach for the patient? And I think we have to take another step back and maybe look at a broader perspective here, because it's not what is the right diet, period, which kind of implies what is the right dietary approach for everybody. But we maybe need to look at what is the right dietary approach at this point in time for this particular patient. There are so many different dietary approaches out nowadays. We have paleo, autoimmune paleo, we have Whole30, we have the mitochondrial food plan, which is a Institute for Functional Medicine dietary protocol similar to maybe paleo would be the closest to compare. Let's see, there's vegan, vegetarian, there's carnivore, there's keto carnivore, there's keto, there is the DASH diet, the Mediterranean diet, the South Beach diet, the Atkins diet, this feels like a pop quiz on do I know all my dietary approaches. I know there's way more than that. Oh, the SIBO diet, low FODMAP, low fermentation, anti-candida. See, there's more in there. But there's so many dietary approaches, and not to forget the eat right for your blood type or eat right for your phenotype in its upgraded version. So where do we start, and which is the right approach? So again, I would say this to my colleagues, my students, and to my patients. Who is the patient in front of you, and where are they at right now? So first, we have a very sensitive group of patients where we need to be extra cautious, and those are the ones with a history of disordered eating. So I always tread lightly and make sure in my history to assess for any history of disordered eating And whether that is diagnosable or actually just a patient who's maybe taken on an unhealthy approach, an all or nothing kind of approach with dietary interventions, and maybe ended up more malnourished or causing other problems because of the dietary plan that was chosen. So treading lightly with that and making sure we have an open conversation on why are we choosing a particular dietary approach in this case, and is this actually an all or nothing scenario, or can we be a bit more liberal about it? And in general, I will say there are some food groups where I do counsel my patients to 100% avoid them, especially if it's in a therapeutic approach, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So first, I want to make sure and really, really highlight, especially if there are any practitioners listening to this podcast, please, please, please make sure when you're making dietary modifications for your patients that you have a clear understanding of what their history is with food and food intake. And it's really important to come from a loving place. And we should never say this is the diet, the only diet, or only food-based intervention available. There is always gray area. I shouldn't say always, but most of the time there are gray areas where we can maybe be a little bit more kind, generous, and even compassionate in the approach. I know many times when I was still a clinical supervisor, my students would recommend a dietary approach, and it was, well, if they didn't do that to the T exactly, the patient failed. And so putting the blame on the patient rather than, taking a step back and saying, okay, we recommended this dietary approach to the patient. Why were they not able to be compliant? So make sure if there are any practitioners, or even if you yourself have found a dietary approach that you feel is the right approach for you, how are you coming at it with your history in relationship to food? I know there's a big community now, and there's this newer disordered eating, orthorexia, where we're fearful of ingesting foods that are not healthy for us. And I'm definitely guilty of that one, where it is a very big fear-based approach. When we are confronted with a food that we know may not be in our highest good, or that may not be the healthiest, what choice do we make? And I think at this point in time, when I counsel my patients around that, again, 80-20 rule, listen to that podcast, but also, is the stress of eating the food worse than actually eating the food? And I think that's really important to take into consideration when we are coming at it from a dietary intervention approach. And this is where 80-20 rule comes in, unless we're doing something more strict like an elimination diet. Oh, there's one I forgot to mention. An actual elimination diet, which AIP Whole30 are types of elimination diets. But that being said, making sure we have a good relationship with the food that we're putting into our body, I think, is the most important thing, possibly even more important than what we're putting into our system. Because if we're putting things into our system and we're bringing them in during a high cortisol state, our limbic system, our emotional response system, is more likely to react. And we're actually more likely to have a reaction to that food, even if that food would have never caused a problem. So I think setting the groundwork in regards to talking about different dietary interventions is really, really important. Now, the other thing, and this is where we're not going to dive into each one of these dietary interventions in and of themselves, at least not today. Maybe I will do a few highlight dietary interventions down the road. But today I want to give you more of an overview of what my approach is when I am working with a patient, because there's just so much confusion and there are so many options out there. And I think the more options we're faced with, the more easily we are overwhelmed. And then we get, at least I get the feeling of like, oh my gosh, am I doing the right thing when it comes to my own personal health? So with my patients, if my patient comes in with an autoimmune condition, for instance, I may very well use something like the autoimmune paleo as an elimination diet for short term only. And when I say for short term, this is for 1 to 3 months, depending on how severe the condition is. And then making sure not to leave them in that dietary intervention, so not leaving them stuck for the remainder of their life in autoimmune paleo, but rather allowing them a way to exit that. So after the elimination phase is set or is over and we've done the gut protocol, then we actually need to do the reintroduction. Okay, so again, if a patient comes in with an autoimmune condition and they're available to make more drastic dietary changes, something like the autoimmune paleo protocol is really, really, really helpful. And it's also so easy nowadays, or relatively easy nowadays, because there are so many guides, resources, recipe books. I mean, you name it, it's available. And as much as I would prefer patients completely stay away from processed foods, there are some processed foods out there that are AIP friendly and they're labeled as such. And even I think Thrive Market, what I love about them is that they actually allow you to search by AIP. So if you're finding snacks that, you may need packaged on the go for your kids, for you, you can actually search by autoimmune paleo or AIP, and it makes your shopping a lot easier. So for me, AIP is convenience for my patients that are highly inflamed. Now, I have other autoimmune patients who are in just such a state of overwhelm where completely shifting their dietary intake around is not an option, or they have financial constraints where buying foods that are in line with autoimmune paleo may not be affordable for them. So then what do? Obviously, there are so many things you can do. And a much simpler version that I take with these kind of patients, or just somebody who's not willing to or open to going through changing their dietary intake that drastically, is actually just a very simple top allergen elimination. So definitely always with autoimmunity, I have them eliminate for 1 to 3 months gluten, dairy. Those are the top two. Okay. Eggs, depending on where they are. If they are a vegetarian, then maybe we keep eggs in because that might be a source of protein they need. And again, depends on why they're having autoimmunity. And I know that some people are probably going to disagree with me. Yes, I'm aware viruses grow on eggs. So again, depends on the source and if it's feasible for the patient. So top being gluten and dairy, next being eggs, I can speak. Eggs, nuts, soy. Those are the big 5 that I would say if we can eliminate, take them out for 1 to 3 months while we're doing a gut healing protocol. Now, anytime I do dietary interventions where we are doing a elimination diet, which even taking out the top 5 allergens is technically an elimination diet, if we are not making progress and seeing an improvement in health within a month, then we may consider taking out some other foods that are very common that may be a little bit more highly inflammatory to the body. So again, there's always a gray area. There's always something we can do to take a gentle approach with our patients. So autoimmune paleo is my top choice. If somebody needs to still do an elimination diet but can't handle that many drastic changes. So those are my top 2 choices, and in between there I should say is Whole30. Whole30 is another very nice elimination diet. It really focuses on whole foods, which I appreciate, and again, gluten-free, dairy-free, and I think that makes it really palatable for a lot of patients. Not the fact that it's missing gluten and dairy, but rather it's another one that's really easy to find recipes for. It's very mainstream nowadays, so it's much easier to be compliant with that. And again, removing the top 5 allergens, gluten, dairy, eggs, soy, and nuts. Those are the ones that if somebody just is having a hard time wrapping their mind around it, just take those 5 out. And I always like to focus on what you can eat, not on what you can't eat. So I usually provide handouts to my patients focusing on what you can eat, not on what to avoid. So shopping lists, I generally love those. It's like, here's pre-printed, just highlight what you need, cross out the rest. Okay, so that is one type of dietary approach that I do with my patients. And here's the other. So, and that's for my autoimmune patients. For somebody who comes in with gut dysfunction and say they are positive for SIBO, an autoimmune paleo diet is not going to do them any good. A whole foods diet is not appropriate. a Whole30 diet may not be appropriate, but they actually need a FODMAP diet. And there are different kinds of low FODMAP diets. There's a SIBO protocol. There's the, I think it's Dr. Seebecker's 2-phase protocol. There's a low fermentation protocol. Most of the time, I will, again, what is simplest, what's easiest for my patients to have access to and understanding. I use the low FODMAP diet. Monash University has a really nice app for that, so it makes it a lot easier. If you type in low FODMAP, you get so much information on the internet in terms of recipes. You're probably not going to get bored with the food you're eating because there is a lot of variety within that. Low fermentation is a little bit easier for some people because it's avoiding fewer foods. But I will say I've worked with some patients who came to me on the low fermentation diet, and it was really hard to find recipes, and a lot of it had to be created from scratch in terms of, okay, well, you can't eat this, that, and the other, so now you have to modify recipes, and it just seems a lot harder. That's why I generally don't use a low fermentation diet, but rather do, again, a low FODMAP diet while we're undergoing treatment, and then also making sure to challenge foods as we're coming out of the treatment period. So again, I see a lot of patients who've been eating low-fat FODMAP for a really long time because it's treating their symptoms, but nobody treated the underlying cause, or maybe the underlying cause was treated, but we didn't expand out of the diet, which was very constraining. So those are very basic approaches, and that's what I see most often next to candida. So that's the other dietary intervention that I will recommend a more specific type of dietary protocol. And with the anti-candida diet, or with candida, there is a more traditional anti-candida diet, and then there is the body ecology diet, which I actually really, really love, which is re-establishing a healthy microbiome. Now, again, the anti-candida diet, there is a lot more on the internet. If you're looking for recipes, you type in anti-candida diet, you get a lot of great recommendations for recipes, and they are great. And if you go to bodyecology.com, which is a very different approach, you can find some recipes there. One focuses on starving candida, and one, the body ecology, focuses more on, yes, still starving the candida, but reestablishing a more healthy microbiome and using other microbes to outcompete candida. And this is very interesting because, and I tread lightly here, so patient with mold and candida, I'm more likely to put on the anti-candida food plan because the anti-candida foods, it's avoiding higher histamine foods, not directly, but indirectly. It's avoiding fermented foods, which are high in histamine. Mold patients generally do not react well to highly fermented foods because of the histamine. And then they're already mold toxic with mycotoxins. We want to decrease any risk of additional mycotoxins, which unfortunately sometimes some fermented foods may have some traces of mycotoxins. So I'm always more cautious with my mold patients and put them on a anti-candida food plan, which avoids, it's basically a low glycemic food plan and avoids highly starchy foods, sugars, sweeteners, those kind of things. However, if one of my patients only has candida because they've been taking a ton of antibiotics, the body ecology diet, I think, actually works better for those patients specifically, as long as they do not have a history of mold. And I say this because the body ecology diet actually focuses on increasing dietary diversity and replenishing a healthy microbiome, and again, diversity. So I think that's the overview of the most commonly used dietary interventions that I use in my clinical practice. But really, for most patients, the one thing that I stress the most is dietary diversity, especially when it comes to fiber and micronutrients. So if you were to sit down with me and you're an average healthy patient, whatever that might mean, not coming in with multiple autoimmune conditions, specifically mold, candida, or SIBO, for instance, then we have that conversation of like, well, what diet, you don't see my air quotes if you're listening, what dietary intervention is actually right for me? And this is where we have a really fun conversation and we start talking about, can you eat the rainbow, not the Skittles kind, Wrong rainbow. I mean the naturally occurring foods in nature rainbow. Because when you eat the rainbow, you get more micronutrients and you actually increase the diversity of your microbiome. Now, there's a little bit more that goes into that, but let's back up. Let's build a, air quotes here again, healthy plate. Okay, what I would consider a balanced plate. And it's interesting, one of the more recent versions of a balanced plate is very easy to conceptualize and visualize, but I noticed it's missing something really important. Fats. Those are actually really, really important. I'm not sure where they went. So my plate is a plate with a side dish, apparently, and that's okay. I'll roll with it. So I generally recommend that my patients take half their plate, like a dinner-sized plate, and that should be non-starchy vegetables. And that's really important that those are the non-starchy veggies. Really, anything counts. Get as many colors in there as possible. This is where your fiber lives, right? So the more diversity you have in there, and this could be a side salad, this could be a sauteed dish if you're eating a soup or a stew, this could be fibrous veggies within there, right? We can get really creative, but half your plate should be non-starchy, very colorful veggies. A quarter should be your starches and your grains, which is probably opposite to what most people do, right? So we want a small portion of grains and starches. And here's where we have a side conversation about resistant starches. So anytime we can cook and cool a starch, it actually makes it lower glycemic and increases resistant starches, which actually is really beneficial for blood sugar regulation as well as your microbiome. So I always love my BOGOs, the buy one, get one, or eat one, get one. I have to come up for an acronym with that. But here's the thing, if you can have a quarter of your plate as a resistant starch, this is your grains and your starchy vegetables, this is where your potato could come in, right? Which might just be a small side potato and maybe a little bit of grain, or, like half of a russet potato, whatever starch you like. And then we do the other quarter is your protein. And I usually say a good recommendation protein size for each meal is about the palm of your hand. And that's usually more referred to as like a steak specifically. But it makes it easy for people to visualize, especially when we're cooking, right? A quarter of your plate or the palm of your hand should provide adequate protein on average. Now, if you're an athlete and you're working and you're doing HIIT trainings or running marathons or lifting weights, you may need a lot more protein than that. And that's where we actually do a gram-based calculation based on your body weight, and then we can look at how that translates. Now, again, as I mentioned, we're missing the fat. We have a full plate and we're missing the fat. And fat is so important. Fats are necessary for your brain, for your cells, for absorbing fat-soluble nutrients. So if we don't eat fats, we lose a lot. And then also fats actually stabilize our blood sugar and turn our food into slow release. Now, if we deep fry things, fats can really be problematic. They increase ages, and anything that's deep fried, especially if it's carby or sweetened deep fried, can cause a lot of big problems. So I would say avoid deep frying things. We all love the occasional fries or chips. Enjoy. 80-20 rule. I'm a firm believer in that. It's what you do most of the time that mostly matters. Just making sure we drive that point home. And yes, so fats. I would say about an eighth to a quarter of a plate should be fat. Now, it depends on what kind of fat it is. If we're talking about, say, an avocado, I would say half of an avocado for most people is probably plenty and super filling. But if it's one of those teeny tiny little avocados, just eat the whole thing. If we're talking about healthy oils, this is your extra virgin olive oil, potentially your avocado oil, coconut oil, mixture of those, butter, ghee, healthy oils, right? So whether you drizzle them over your non-starchy vegetables or however you like them, I mean, salad dressings are great because they combine oil and vinegar. That's really nice, but it's really important not to forget the fats. So that's kind of how I build a plate with my patients. Again, the whole dinner plate with a side of healthy fats. is so, so, so important for your overall well-being. And that's the base. Now, I know a lot of people get stuck in the same, like it's almost a dietary rut. We eat the same thing, breakfast, lunch, dinner, over, rinse and repeat every day. Or maybe we have, meatless Monday, Taco Tuesday, I don't know, Wellington Wednesdays. Clearly, I don't do themes in my food preparation for days of the week. But some people do, and I love it, and that's fun. But if you're eating the same thing week after week, that can actually diminish your microbiome. And so the more diversity we can bring in the foods that we're eating, the more of a robust, healthy, diverse microbiome we have. And it's interesting, I recently attended a conference, and this was specific for SIBO itself. And they were actually mentioning how better, air quotes again, it seemed that people who had an increased dietary diversity, and I think it was eating at 30 different vegetables throughout the week, had an improved outcome over those who did the low FODMAP diet and took, I think it was antibiotics for treating their SIBO. And that's interesting because we understand SIBO as small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, meaning a translocation of bacteria where they're not supposed to be. They're not really supposed to be overgrown in the small intestine. Bacteria are primarily supposed to inhabit our colon. But again, this is interesting, and there are different reasons why bacteria can go into different places where they're not supposed to. But it is interesting that when people had an increase in diversity, and I'm also guessing this increased their roughage intake, that bacterial counts were normalized. And it's actually truly difficult to test for SIBO. Like, is it actually in the small intestine or large intestine? Yes, I know the timing of the breath. That all makes sense. I understand that. However, I do find it interesting that as people's diversity in their dietary intake increased, that their SIBO started to improve in symptomology and their microbiome improved. So again, if we're eating the same thing day in, day out, week in, week out, and just all the time eating the same foods, our microbiome's diversity really reduces in diversity. And I think that's really important to take note of because we're just now understanding all the bits and pieces that our microbiome actually affects within our body, from our neurotransmitter balance to detoxification to elimination, obviously. But we're just learning. And there's so much of our microbiome. So we want to make sure and have a very diverse microbiome. The more food diversity you can bring into your system, the better. And same thing, we always focus on plants, but I even think with protein intake, diversity is really, really important. If you're eating the same meats over and over again, if that is your source of protein, are we creating a mononutrient intake, and how does that affect our micronutrient status, but also our microbiome status? Because we know that there are different microbes that flourish off of different types of protein, or off of protein versus carbs and fibers. So we're just now understanding how the microbiome is affected by the different kinds of foods we're ingesting, including protein. And we understand that there are different kinds of microbes that preferentially digest or live off of protein products. And I think conventionally that was seen as a bad thing because some of them are inflammatory, but not all of them are inflammatory. So again, does the type of protein you're ingesting actually change and affect your microbiome, even with the microbes that preferentially feed off of protein? Diversity, spice of life. I think that saying is such a beautiful saying because that's really what we should focus on with everything we do in life, is increasing our diversity, whether that is dietary diversity, our social diversity, whatever it is in life, increase diversity. But this podcast is on the microbiome. Actually, not on the microbiome. This podcast is actually on which diet. So anytime we choose one particular dietary approach, we automatically diminish dietary diversity because we are removing really important foods from our dietary intake. And now here are some other things to take into consideration beyond that. So aiming for 30 different vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, would increase your colors, and it increases your fiber intake. So aim for that. Eat seasonal as much as possible. So making sure or not making sure, but I love going to the farmers markets where definitely there is more seasonal produce. I subscribe to a CSA box, a consumer supported agricultural box, and I just love it because it's always a surprise and it keeps me on my toes, not just with my cooking, but also with my microbiome. So I try to do that as much as possible. And then remember, if you've been eating one way or following a particular dietary approach for a long period of time, it might be time to increase your dietary diversity and challenge some of the foods you've been eliminating for a longer period of time, and just re-expand into eating more openly. So the other thing I want to address with this is, I know there's the Eat Right for Your Blood Type diet. Personally followed that for quite some time. And in a way, I still do a little bit, which is interesting because I see a lot of patients who are almost automatically or subconsciously eating closer to Eat Right for Your Blood Type diet. And so this dietary approach has a very special place in my heart. But at the same time, personally, when I was pregnant, that no longer worked for me. And my kid had the same blood type as me. So it wasn't that suddenly I was harboring a different blood type in my body, but, in my uterus, not in my body. That's still the same blood. But here's the thing, I was getting low on some nutrients and I needed those, and I started craving foods, and I listened to my body. And I generally would always recommend, if you have cravings, unless they're carbs, listen to that. That's your body communicating. It's very, very intelligent. And this is where I think we've done away so much with our body's innate intelligence. So I always ask, do you have any cravings? Again, the sugary, carby thing, that definitely means possibly candida or some energy deficits. But if you're craving things like meats or, or certain, even fruits or vegetables, if you just have a certain craving, that can indicate certain nutrients are actually deficient. So for me, I was actually becoming nutrient deficient, and I started eating meat. So the Eat Right for Your Blood Type, I'm a type A. Meats are not generally in alignment with a type A. And so I was a vegetarian for 7 years. I became pregnant. I craved meat, and I always promised myself if I ever crave it, I'm going to make sure obviously it's ethically sourced, but I would start consuming it again. And since then, it's very much waxed and waned on how much that I crave meat. And there are definitely times where I'm craving it, and other times I have a complete aversion to it. So that's the other factor, is do you have aversions to certain foods? Maybe they're not good for you. Air quotes. Good is relative, bad is relative. I think you know what I mean. From a health perspective, your body may reject them. So some other things to take into consideration are, what is your ancestry, right? Because that makes a difference in your dietary intake. And I know there's this big thing, the lectins, and lectins is a big thing for some people, and there are people that are very lectin sensitive, and I think that is based more on ancestral makeup, and we can actually look at your genetics to understand, are you potentially prone to having problems with lectins? It's not that these foods are toxic to everyone, it's just they're toxic to some because we don't have the internal mechanism to properly break them down, and other people have all the proper mechanisms to break them down because we co-evolved. I always look at, traditional cultures like the Inuit, who actually eat a very high, fat intake, and their bodies function differently with less plant intake and more fat protein intake. If I were to eat that way, that may not go so well with me because I do not have that in my ancestry. So, and we're all blended nowadays. Most of us are pretty blendy, which I love, and I think that's beautiful. Makes it a little bit harder to trace back, okay, which ancestry component is my body and my GI tract responding to? Well, here's the thing. If you eat local, your body gets information from the local environment as well, because that is part of your microbiome. So you started with some microbes, and say for me, I came from Germany, I immigrated to the United States. My microbiome in Germany was probably very different. Yes, I ate different foods there too, but now, oh boy, Over 20 years later, it's been a while. Over 20 years later, my microbiome is drastically changed, and not just because I've had antibiotics, this, that, and the other, but rather it's acclimated. And, especially since I've been here in San Diego, dietary diversity for me has changed a little bit, or a lot. I actually don't know because I didn't assess it before I moved here. But I always say try to eat local as much as possible. And then if you are curious, or if you're having gut symptoms or even just inflammatory symptoms, maybe that's when you take it a step further and either look at food sensitivities or look at trying out the Eat Right for your blood type, or taking it a step further, maybe doing the autoimmune paleo, which does eliminate lectins, and use that as a starting point, and then grow diversity out of that and try. I definitely have patients who every time they eat nightshades, for instance, they can tell they feel more inflamed or their gut goes sideways. They actually have symptoms. And it's not just one nightshade, it's multiples. It's very noticeable to them every time they eat a nightshade. Same with patients who are lectin sensitive. Every time they eat something with lectins in it, their gut is in knots. They don't feel well. Okay? Then eliminate the lectins. But you don't have to eliminate the lectins and the nightshades and this, that, and the other, right? So focusing always to try and improve our dietary diversity as much as possible. And I think that those are the main points that I discuss with my patients. And of course, we personalize it depending on where they're at. And some people have dietary restrictions because, say, they're celiac and they can't eat gluten. Gluten, on that note, gluten is not bad for everybody. The gluten we have here, the way it's conventionally processed, that's bad for everybody. But most patients that are not celiac or truly non-celiac gluten sensitive can actually tolerate really good gluten sources. Yes, I said that. Think more ancestral grains and make sure it's organic. Okay, that's, I think, a really, really big point to highlight when I talk to my patients about dietary approaches. If you did nothing, avoid pesticides, avoid non-organic food as much as possible, because if you are constantly ingesting herbicides, pesticides, most often glyphosate being the biggest culprit, but we're finding out there's others that are causing a whole horde of other problems. Glyphosate, for most people, for everybody, not most people, for everybody, is very inflammatory to the GI lining. It actually can cause gastritis. It functions as an antibiotic. So if you're taking small doses of antibiotics multiple times a day, that probably is not going to go well for increasing dietary diversity or lowering your candida, right? So now you're bringing in carbs with some antibiotics. I'm sure most of you, if you've ever taken an antibiotic, you have felt the effects of a large dose of antibiotics and what that has done on your GI tract. So if you're taking small quantities all day, every day, that's an additive effect, and it may just occur over time, so you might not notice it as drastically. But again, if I work with the patient and we're focusing on health, and even if it is just improving health and they have no ailments, I would say avoid non-organic, especially grains, or highly sprayed crops. EWG has a great list. The Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen. So you can find that list on ewg.org. I really love using their app that they have, as well as just their little pocket minder of what foods are not sprayed as much, so they don't have as much pesticide residue. Okay, so processed foods. Promise this is the last point. When we eat highly processed foods, they are devoid of nutrients. Yes, we've been tricked into thinking that they're fortified. Didn't see my air quotes there either. It's interesting how many times I do air quotes. So these foods, these highly processed foods, are fortified. So we've been taught to see them almost as a multivitamin. Like, you need these foods to make sure you meet your RDA, your recommended daily allotment of these nutrients. And if we actually were to eat a whole food, plant-based, not just plant-based as in no animal products, but a plant-heavy, I should say, a plant-heavy dietary intake, we would be meeting all of our RDAs, iodine being the exception, because that is actually only found really in seafood or with supplementation specifically, so be mindful of that. But if you were to eat a very diverse diet, you wouldn't need these fortified foods. Just like with milk, we think that's the only place to get calcium is dairy products. Yes, dairy products can be a great source of calcium for some people. For other people, it can cause problems. And we're not even going to go down the rabbit hole of which kind of dairy is best today. Maybe that'll be an episode in and of itself. But it is important to take a look at where could we be getting these nutrients in our food as a whole food approach versus where can we buy these fortified nutrients that are synthetic in many places, and actually just eat real food. People, eat real food. Feed your microbiome with lots of diversity, and your body will actually make some of these nutrients. Your microbiome, thank you microbiome, works day and night to make nutrients for us. So let's feed it well. And I think that's the real takeaway from today is not what dietary approach is right for you, but find something that works, that increases diversity. Eat lots and lots of veggies, lots of colors, eat the rainbow. It's a fun challenge I do with my kids, actually. Well, I used to do that with my kids where we were eating rainbow foods and we would try to make rainbow plates. And it's a lot of fun. You get a lot of dietary diversity, a lot of phytonutrients, which are really good and support the body in many different healthy operations that it needs. So unless you actually need to be on a special dietary intervention, such as autoimmune paleo, low FODMAP, anti-candida, anything like that, just focus on eating the rainbow. Eat lots of fiber, as much fiber as you can. We're just understanding how much fiber. But that's really the takeaway is make sure we expand our diet as much as possible and we don't get cornered into highly restrictive diets, and come at it from a place of compassion and love, and make sure you take into consideration the 80-20 rule, which I do think is so important, especially from a place of compassion towards ourselves, understanding why are we making these choices. Is this for our highest good? Does this move the needle forward? Is this caring for ourselves? Is this loving on ourselves? And then if the answer is yes, and it's a cheeseburger and you're not celiac and non-celiac gluten sensitive, maybe just go enjoy the cheeseburger. Somebody's got to eat it, or get it as a lettuce wrap. That's my trick. I still get to eat out occasionally and have the best food possible and just indulge, live a little. Don't get stuck in the, oh my God, this wasn't organic, I am going to implode. And I definitely have had patients where there was such a fear around eating food that was either non-organic or not cooked at home, where the stress, the cortisol level, cortisol causes intestinal permeability. It actually causes us to age faster. Well, what would have been worse, the stress or eating the food? Well, I would argue the stress is much worse than the food. So I think I'll leave it at that for today. This has been a little lengthy episode, so I hope you've thoroughly enjoyed it. I know there is so much information in here. Listen to it twice, maybe take some notes. I'll try to recap it in the show notes as best as possible for you, but there are some really nice takeaways in here, and I think the easiest way to remember it is half your plate in non-starchy, colorful rainbow veggies, a quarter in starches, grains, bonus points if they're resistant starches, and then a quarter of your plate in protein, and then an eighth to a quarter, depending on what the fat source is, in healthy fats like avocado, extra virgin olive oil. And there you go. Enjoy. Don't forget your spices. Spice it up. Food tastes good, should taste good, and it should be enjoyed. All right, my loves. That's all for today. I'm going to let you go. And just a reminder, the wait list for my 28-day gut and hormone reset is still open. I will be giving you more details in the near future. I'm really hoping to get this out to you in the next couple of weeks even, because I'm putting together all the materials for you. And as I'm creating the course, obviously some of the episodes are inspired by that. So if you want to learn more, make sure you get onto my waitlist down below. And if you're interested in anything else that I can provide for you, just DM me. Ask me a question. I would love to do an episode on Ask Dr. K. So please start submitting your questions to me on my Instagram at divine_woman_wellness. And we can maybe do a Q&A session, which I think would be really fun, because I actually love educating people on things that they are curious about. So I will make sure and I think put a direct link down in the notes below wherever you're listening so you can access. And then I would love, love, love if you could give me a rate and review wherever you're listening. And I would be so thrilled if you would post one of your favorite takeaways on Instagram, or if you give me a review, just take a screenshot and tag me in your stories on Instagram. I would love to connect with you, and I hope you have a beautiful day. That's it. Hope you're enjoying summer, and we'll talk soon. Much love. Bye.